Okay, here we go. It's a pleasure to be here. Shirin asked me to talk about our new guidelines for intersectional analysis in science and technology. So we're all experts around sex and gender analysis, but now research is moving quickly to intersectional analysis. And importantly, the European Commission now requires applicants to include sex, gender, and/or intersectional analysis into the design of research or justify that it's not required. Now, the intersectional part is not absolutely required now, but I was on a meeting with the EU last week in Warsaw, Poland, and they said it's coming, and soon it will be required as well. So the problem is that researchers, especially in the STEM fields, don't know how to do this kind of sophisticated analysis. They didn't learn it in their graduate work. They didn't learn it in their professional work. So this is something that we have to change. So let me begin from the very beginning. In the past decades, peer-reviewed journals have adopted guidelines aimed at promoting excellence in science. In 2016, of course, the important SAGER guidelines were established for reporting sex and gender analysis in research. And they were endorsed by EASE, the European Association of Science Editors, and now have been adopted by many, many journals. Elsevier, which is already thousands of journals, Nature Publishing, Cell Press, and then other society and independent journals. And of course, Shirin headed up this initiative. So similarly, in the 2020s, many journals, including JAMA, Nature, and The Lancet, published guidelines for reporting race and ethnicity, largely as a response to Black Lives Matter. So these guidelines are all extremely important, but in a way, they're single issue approaches that can miss the compounded impact at the intersections of, say, gender and race, or, say, geographic location and caste, or sexuality, socioeconomic class, and age. So the GIST guidelines, we call our guidelines the GIST guidelines, take an intersectional approach. That is to say, they consider the vast array of sociocultural factors that may be at play, and more importantly, they consider their intersections or compounded impacts. So our efforts to extend intersectional analysis to the STEM fields began with this Nature paper that you see here, published in April, and Shirin was already a valued member of that author group. So this Nature paper reported on methodologies and case studies for quantitative intersectional research. As you know, intersectional analysis was created historically by scholars in the humanities and social sciences for qualitative research, beginning already in the 1970s. Some people push it back to the 1960s. Since then, quantitative intersectional approaches have emerged across diverse fields such as public health has been a leader, political science, and labor economics. Pressing technological developments and environmental challenges make it critical now to extend intersectional approaches to technology and natural sciences, and that's what our Nature paper attempts to do. So in this paper, we developed the guidelines for intersectional analysis in science and technology, or GIST, which we presented in the supplement of this paper. So GIST provides a roadmap for researchers, journal editors, and funding bodies to systematically incorporate intersectional perspectives into the research design, from setting strategic priorities to shaping research questions to data collection, analysis, and interpretation. So quickly, I don't know where you all are, what is intersectionality? So intersectionality describes overlapping and intersecting forms of discrimination related to gender, sex, disabilities, age, sexuality, whatever categories are important to your research question. The term was coined in 1989 by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how multiple forms of discrimination intersect, especially in Black women's lives. And let me show you how intersectionality works in quantitative research on facial recognition. This is now an iconic example, and you probably know it already. So facial recognition is a vision software that opens your phone. It's used for international borders. And, be careful when you're passing through there. You better look the same way you look in the database. and even now in healthcare. But facial recognition doesn't work well for everyone. And so what does this mean? So while a graduate student at MIT, Joy Buolamwini learned that the facial recognition system she was building could not see her face until she put on a white mask. So her system couldn't see her. So she switched her research from the technical development of facial recognition to something called gender shades. And here is her important analysis. So here we have an intersectional analysis. So the gender analysis shows that the system performs better on men's faces overall than on women's faces. The skin tone analysis shows that the system works better on lighter skin overall than on darker skin. But then we get to the intersectional analysis that shows that the system performed worse for Black women. The error rate was 35% for Black women. That's really not acceptable. Then you go to darker skinned men, and it was 12%, 7% for lighter skinned women, and then for lighter skinned men, it was 1% or almost no error because they had trained the system on their own faces. So if Joy and her team had looked only at gender or skin tone separately, she wouldn't have captured the full story. So here we have an intersectional innovation. I always like it when there are solutions to problems. Buolamwini and GENDRO created an inclusive data set that included faces from men and women with darker and lighter skin. They chose members of parliament from 3 countries in Africa, 3 countries in Europe, because those are public faces and you can show them. And this is a more inclusive data set. The systems perform better, but what problem do you see still? Is the data set inclusive globally? So my students see this immediately. There are no Asians, and there are no indigenous people from the Americas or from Australia. And we don't know if there are any non-binary people. We have no idea. So we still need innovations to make the technology work the best it can for everyone. So Gendered Innovations in 2021 also released a tool for intersectionality. These are our intersectional design cards, and I'm surprised that they won an award in the UK because of our designers. They're really quite beautiful cards. And we defined these 12 factors. These cards we made specifically for like companies in Silicon Valley, for industry. They want something quick where they can grasp meanings very quickly. They don't want to read a research paper. And so these cards are on our website. You can experience them digitally. They're actually better in person. And here you'll be interested to see our apples intersectional list of factors. And given the situation in the US, I went to see if they're still on Apple's website, and they are. So I'm delighted about that. And it's a very inclusive list. Political beliefs, I'm not sure how you would even design around that, or, but anyway, one I like here very much is handedness. Whether you're right-handed or left-handed. I have a neighbor, the Stanford faculty live on the Stanford campus. My neighbor is a world-class hand surgeon, but she's left-handed. Surgical instruments are made for right-handers. So think of how awesome she could be if the instruments had met her needs instead of her needing to meet the instrument's needs. So I think handedness is a very good one. Many of these are very good ones. So now the first point to make is that factors differ by culture. Both of these sets were developed in the US. And so Europeans often tell us they can't include race, for example. But because we all design for global cultures, Europeans and other people may still need to consider a broad global set of factors. The second point to make is that each researcher needs to choose the factors most relevant to their product or to their research question. You can't look at all the factors, but you need to choose through a literature research or whatever method you have what you want to focus on. You shouldn't rely on an unconscious default. So these examples demonstrate why we need intersectional analysis in science and technology. And this type of analysis enhances accuracy in science and technology. We think that precision is the best way to guide effective social and environmental policies that promote global equity and environmental sustainability, and in this way support the SDGs. We were delighted that EASE, the European Association of Science Editors, endorsed our guidelines and encouraged us to present a fuller checklist, which we published in September, just last month. And here it is. This article is easy to find and download, and you can find the checklist here. You see it goes through the research process from signaling whatever in the title, talking about if intersectionality is in the results, mention that in the abstract. It goes through the whole process here and is very much modeled on the SAGER guidelines, which have been so helpful. So one question I'd like to discuss with you all in the after I'm finished speaking in the Q&A is what languages should we translate these guidelines into? I see that the SAGER guidelines were translated into 30 languages, mostly by volunteers. And the website then has a disclaimer that EASE is not responsible for any errors, but we intend to have, so AI can do an initial translation, and then but we need humans to look it over because I noticed that AI confuses the term sex and gender, for example. We're talking about very sensitive social categories, and they need to make sense in that language and for that culture. So I'm curious what languages you would recommend. So the GIST guidelines are intended to be valid for publishing in peer-reviewed journals globally. Important to our methodology in creating the guidelines was assembling a global author group. We had authors from Africa, from both Kenya and South Africa, from Asia, both China and South Korea, from Europe, always too many, Denmark, Italy, Switzerland, and the UK, and from the US. Our second strategy was to have a multidisciplinary group of authors. We had authors from sociology, which is important for intersectionality, marine science, which I am so excited about, public health, climate science, planetary health, African American studies, information studies, race and digital justice, food and nutrition, environment and energy, computer science, electrical engineering, and history of science. So we really made an effort to make our now 13 authors count. So in addition, a number of us have been involved in developing the intellectual foundations for policies aimed at integrating sex and gender analysis into research. Some of us have worked on policies for funding agencies for the European Commission, the National Research Foundation of South Africa, the U.S. National Institutes of Health, and the Global Research Council. Others of us are major editors of peer-reviewed journals. You will have seen Richard Horton's name there from The Lancet, and of course, Shirin, who was instrumental in developing the SAGER guidelines. So intersectional analysis can be complicated. This well-known example I gave you, the Apple examples I gave you, our own design card examples, mostly work at this level, at the individual user level, which we designate here as the socio-political dimension. So these are important, But we, in the Nature paper, we conceptualize intersectional factors at three interconnected levels. The familiar sociopolitical dimensions, which include social identity, sex, gender, the things you expect. These are importantly embedded in contextual domains, such as the legal system, the healthcare system, educational systems, all that sort of thing. And these two levels are further embedded in the environmental level or the planetary system, such as air, soil, water quality. So it's understanding the push and pull between these three basic levels that is important for intersectional analysis. We don't provide a visualization in the Nature paper, but if we did, it might look something like this. This is on the Gendered Innovations website. Here are the three nested, interrelated domains important to the environmental emphasis that we have in the Nature paper. Our examples focus on sustainability, planetary health, and AI where possible. So let's see if this kind of visualization is helpful. Here's our familiar sociopolitical dimensions. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to give you an example from fast fashion, which, as you know, is trendy fashion that's made very quickly, but of poor quality. And so my example is about plastics. So we see here, so we see how this planetary intersectionality works with the example of plastic, which is the problem today. So we first have fast fashion is fueled by consumer purchasing, which we consider here at the sociopolitical level. Their consumer demand differs by all of these characteristics: ethnicity, disability, geographic location, socioeconomic status. Then fast fashion produces plastic fibers. These are released when polyesters are washed or laundered. So these fibers and their microplastics are discharged into the oceans, which take us into the environmental level. Then in the oceans, these plastics have sex-specific effects on living organisms or fish and different marine organisms. For instance, BPA disrupts reproduction, metabolism, and development in clams and in other fish, where females experience greater exposure because they're often the larger of the two. The females often in marine organisms are larger than the males. So then these plastics are eaten through the human food supply, which brings us here to the social domain. And this is where the chemicals enter our food. A recent study estimated that an average person consumes 74 to 120,000 microplastic particles per year. So importantly, then, this consumption brings us back down to the sociopolitical dimension because consumption varies by sex, age, dietary patterns, and that sort of thing. So we've come full circle. So this is just one example of the type of approach that we are interested in. So of course, there are many innovations in this clothing space, and I'll mention just one. This is a fully biodegradable Japanese sneaker made in part from seaweed. So I would like to get some of those. So our EASE paper, these are the guidelines I showed you earlier, I think. So the EASE paper is intended primarily for peer-reviewed journal editors, but also for use by researchers and funding agencies. And we're now launching a campaign, as I said, to have them translated and approved by peer-reviewed journals globally. So if you're a journal editor, I would really love it if you could introduce our guidelines to your journal and make them available to the instructions in your instructions to authors. As with the SAGER guidelines, making the GIST guidelines part of the peer review process will help journal editors standardize terminology. It will support best practices for reporting intersectional analysis, and raise awareness among researchers of best methods in this area. So please link our two papers, the Nature paper and the EASE paper, on your websites where it's relevant, and mention them in your lectures if you're faculty. Work with them, use them in your research teams and your classes. The goal is to reset the research default to include intersectional analysis where this is appropriate. Again, precision in research best guides social and economic policy, which supports equity, both for us and for the environment. So I'm ending now. So I would like to discuss with you, to hear from you, the further steps that we could take to encourage adoption of these guidelines. So thank you for your warm support. There's much to be done, but together we can accomplish a lot. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Londa, for this interesting and packed presentation. And I really like the examples, but it gives a little bit of a flavor of how these could be applied. Let me stop the recording.